and this is going to sound like a dumb question. Maybe it is a dumb question, but I'm not sure. Is there such a thing as the moderate abortion voter that Mary Catherine was alluding to? My experience is that there are people who really care about the issue and vote on that, and there are people who care about other stuff and vote on other stuff. And I'm not sure that there actually is out there someone who is abortion's the number 16 issue on my list, and now that I've worked through the other 15, that's going to be the thing that moves the needle between Trump and Harris for me. Is it politically actually all that live?
I think it can be, by pointing to the extremes on both sides. I mean, I just off the top of my head, I have a swing voter who shall remain nameless in Wisconsin, and mine who has generally voted Democratic, and I know that in the year 2000 voted for George W. Bush because of the partial birth abortion debate. That when he framed it that way, and it was so extreme, that was too far for this person who may or may not be related to me. So I could see. The Democratic convention demonstrated why it's become such a vulnerability. I mean, the Harris campaign throughout the convention focused on the hard cases. Abortion, the case of rape. Trump is right about that this is a very, the numbers have been clear. It's an 80-90% issue that I'm not saying he's right that should be. I'm just saying politically that's a reality there, that it's a vulnerability. And then even worse were these cases where I've written about where the law allowed treatment of women with physical health complications, and doctors, due to fear that they could be punished, delayed treatment wrongly. And as I've written, and the states have taken too long to clarify these things. So if Trump really wanted to help women, help babies, help pro-life women, help himself, I think he could have used his bully pulpit to go around all the states and say, fix this problem. I mean, he did that in Alabama with the IVF issue, and they all fell over themselves to give complete blanket immunity to the industry there. So, the pro-life movement has tried to fix all these problems, and but that doesn't have the clout that Trump does.
Yeah, it's not like they had 50 years to think about how to write good abortion statutes.
To John's point, I wanted to raise something that Jonah mentioned during last week's Dispatch Live, right after Harris's nomination acceptance speech, which is that all of the cases about the negative consequences of Dobbs that were featured at the Democratic convention were people that wanted to have kids, right? Nobody was featured on stage talking about how they wanted to end their pregnancy. All of these horrific stories, and they were horrific, in my view, were about people that desperately wanted their children, but because of a medical necessity, something that had gone wrong in pregnancy, the doctor was recommending abortion. Abortion was necessary for the survival of the mother. And the new laws, or the legal regime that Dobbs created, made it impossible or near impossible for them to get the medically necessary abortion when they needed it. So that's an interesting part of the politics of this from the Democratic side. And Jonah's the one that caught that. I have to give him credit for that. The other thing I wanted to mention here, which I think is it goes to our question about, how are pro-life stalwarts going to feel about this, is the J.D. Vance interview where he said that Donald Trump would veto legislation that would outlaw abortion nationally if it made it to his desk. Now, that is something entirely new from what we heard during the primary from almost any candidate. Nikki Haley, during the Republican primary, who was perceived as the most moderate on abortion, would often say that we need to be honest with Republican voters and explain that a national abortion ban is not going to happen because you're not going to get 60 Senate votes for it, especially because Senators Collins and Murkowski are essentially pro-choice if they're not officially pro-choice. So you really need 62 Republicans. And when pressed, she said eventually, well, sure. I mean, if in the unlikely event that this legislation could actually get 60 votes and make it to my desk, I'd sign it. Well, what Donald Trump is saying explicitly right now is that he won't sign it. Now, that's a very interesting question about how he's moderated and how swing voters might feel about this, and could there be political benefits to that? And that's a good discussion. But to the point of, Kevin, your question, I think that's what's made this really poignant in the moment is the vice presidential nominee's declaration that Trump, in fact, would veto legislation if it actually made it to his desk.
Yeah. Mary Catherine, final thoughts on this?
No, I do think there's a moderately pro-choice voter, and that she is in these suburban collar county areas, college educated, has a couple kids, and is susceptible to the messaging from the Democratic National Convention, is susceptible to maybe a sprinkling of the Handmaid's Tale stuff. Although I always ask them, like, did Trump forget to Handmaid's Tale you last time? Like, what happened? So I think that's an argument that they can make, that there's a record here. But they're also, they don't want extremism either way, right? But they're only told about extremism to the right. And I think, by the way, a lot of the IVF messaging that the Democratic Party is doing, based mostly on this Alabama decision that got quickly corrected, that's what they're targeting them with, because that is the more vulnerable area for those women in particular personally.